Hey, it's Katie Moran. Welcome to the Artistic Spirit podcast. Today I'm here with Zoe Magnetic, teaching you manifestation through self-love and nervous system regulation. She's the host of the Stay Magnetic podcast and a registered psychotherapist and coach. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast today.
I'm so excited. And I manifested this
I love that. It looks
sweatshirt.
so good.
Um,
Yes, I
Yeah,
love it.
so what my first question is since it's Mental Health Awareness Month, what is self-love from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, what a great question. This can be answered in so many different ways, and ultimately self-love, it really is about your relationship with yourself and how you feel about yourself. And how you treat yourself, right? So when you think about, you know, how someone treats it, how what am I trying to say here? When you think about the way someone who loves themselves treats themselves versus the way someone who might not love themselves treats themselves, you might be able to come up with differences there, right? So self-love from a mental health perspective is, you know, the relationship you have with yourself, um, and being able to practice things like self-trust, self-acceptance, self-compassion. It's not about being 100% or being positive all the time, or going through life without any struggles. It's more so about how you still speak to yourself and how you still love yourself regardless of things that are going on around you, and how that relationship with yourself can carry you through the natural ebbs and flows of life. And that's kind of where the mental health component comes in, because sometimes we have this false narrative of, everything needs to be perfect in order for you to feel a certain way, when in reality, you know, life is not perfect. Things are going
Mhm.
to go wrong sometimes. There are challenges, but does your relationship to yourself and does your self-love have to depend on how things are going around you? No, it doesn't. You can still have, strong self-love regardless of what's going on around you, and trust that you can carry yourself through a challenging time, and trust that you can enjoy a really fun time or a really beautiful time.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And I've recently have been learning because I've had like disordered eating in the past, and I have just been like transforming my relationship with food and my body by like kind of like I would tell myself like nourish my temple, and like how my body is like my temple and my vessel and my instrument, and this idea that I can like cook something for my body, and that like a part of like the creative outlet and like the doubts and the worries and the fears can kind of like be like cathartically released during the cooking process, and like eating like foods that are like healthy and like kind of like fresh, because I think I really got into the habit of like what's like kind of like the lowest calorie food that I could eat that I could just microwave. And like I changed my perspective completely when I like started using like fresh herbs from my garden, and like making things that like actually nourished me, and like that idea of like food being nourishment and
Yeah.
like my body being a temple was so transformative for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's so true, right? Like when you think about healing disordered eating, right? It's usually rooted in a fracture in self-love or
Hmm.
trauma or neglect or abuse, right? These are all things that can take up different shapes, and eating disorders can be one of those shapes. And when you start to move through and heal something like disordered eating, you start to behave in a way where you can sit with decisions you're making about nourishing yourself and question, how does someone who loves themselves nourish themselves? How does
Mm.
someone who loves themselves, um, you know, eat throughout the day? Or how is their relationship with food? How do they speak to themselves when they're eating, or if they're hungry, or what type of restrictions are there, right? You can really look at the dynamic of the relationship to the self as it pertains to food, and that can be confronting, but it can also lead to making a new decision with eating habits.
Yeah, for me, like seeing people on social media who like had farms and like I watched like a Michael Pollan masterclass and like kind of like I asked myself like if this like I think I never saw food as like something as like a form of self-development, like kind of like healing your relationship and like kind of like building blocks to like living a life that you want. And that's like by healing what is, like you said, like fractured.
Yeah.
So something that comes up in this idea is like this idea of self-abandonment. And I think like for people who have like experienced like narcissistic abuse or toxic relationships or anything that really like put them down in their self-worth, that they feel like they have to self-abandon as a means to be safe and to survive. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about self-abandonment.
Yeah, self-abandonment basically revolves around this idea that safety is outside of you. You need
Mm,
something external to feel
mm.
safe. You don't feel safe with yourself. So the only option is to abandon yourself because your true self feels threatening to your nervous system, not because you're actually a threat to yourself. I mean, some cases you might be, but more so because being that true self feels too threatening. It feels too scary. It might be associated with rejection if you've experimented with being your authentic self and you were put down or bullied for it, right? So then we look elsewhere for safety, and then in as a result, we abandon ourselves, and then we put our need for safety in other people and other things and other substances and other activities, pretty much anything but ourselves. So self-abandonment really revolves around, a need for safety, but an inability of giving that safety to yourself.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about this from the perspective of how do we give ourselves permission to be our authentic self?
Yeah. You know what, Katie, I love that you asked this because sometimes it can be quite as simple as giving yourself permission, right? Just as we've given ourselves permission to not be our authentic self, and just as we've told ourselves, it's not safe for me to express this view or to show this side of myself or choose this thing that I love because people might think it's uncool, we might dismantle that, or we might deconstruct it and put it in reverse and say, well, what if it is okay if I do that? We experiment with giving ourselves that permission. You know, I invite everyone who's listening to this episode to quite literally say out loud with us right now, I give myself permission to be myself. I
I give myself
myself
permission
to
to
be
be
myself.
myself.
Right. So even just saying it out loud, we're taking the maybe belief that it's not possible, we're putting it out loud, we're saying it out loud, we're putting it out of our brain and into the world, and then we can
Mm.
sit with it and see how it feels, right? So when we give ourselves that permission to be ourselves, that essentially is an act of self-love. It's an act of honoring ourselves. It's a way to acknowledge that we might have been self-abandoning, and we don't need to judge ourselves for self-abandoning. It's a way we've tried to keep ourselves safe, right? And that's okay. And if two things are true at the same time, we can make a new decision in giving ourselves permission. It's never too late to make a new decision. There's no time like the present. And sometimes that act of self love is rooted in giving yourself that permission and creating safety for yourself in your body, in your life, to experiment with ways you can express yourself authentically.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I don't know if you remember this, how we met, but we were in a breakout room and we had to
Yeah.
share like our dreams. And like my ultimate dream is like to write books that are adapted to film and to act in them. And for me, that's like exemplified by Graham Moore, who like won an Oscar for Best Literary Adaptation for The Imitation Game. And he got on the stage and said about how he felt weird and different and was suicidal when he was 16. And then he's like, this is for like the person who feels weird and different. Like when you're on this stage, like pass this message along. And actually I like created a blog, Stay Weird, Stay Different, from
Yeah.
that. And I recently like just started I committed to doing 2 years of daily blog posts to hold myself accountable as a writer and to like just get better at blogging. And like I think about this idea that like really we can only have the future that we want if we are fully ourselves. And like the way that people kind of like get trapped in these lives where they feel like it's not what they want is because like they aren't in touch with like who they are. And I think like that takes so much courage. So what do you say, like first of all, like do you agree with that, that like for our dreams to come true, we have to truly step into who we are to get what we want? And like what does that mean for manifestation? And how can people have the courage to do that if it takes courage?
Yeah, so this is a great question because the everyone who's listening here, like when you think about that dream that you really want, we all have that thing that comes to mind, or maybe a few things, or maybe it's a feeling or like a lifestyle or something, right? Something comes to mind about what we truly, truly want. Keyword here being truly.
Mm-hmm.
The way to that true desire is not by pretending to be someone you're not.
Mm-hmm.
Pretending to be someone you're not is going to lead you to, living a life where you're pretending to be someone you're not. It probably doesn't feel good. It probably doesn't feel as
Mm-hmm.
authentic. So the way to be to that life is by giving yourself that permission, and it is by having enough self-love, not even enough. I don't want to quantify self-love here, but having the self-love to go after the thing that you truly want and show yourself that you accept yourself for who you are, and that you're worthy of that thing that you desire. You deserve that thing that you desire. The very fact that you can even think about this thing that you desire, it means that it's possible for you. It means that it's meant for you. It means that you want it. And this true expression of yourself and this act of self-love of being your authentic self, that is one of the ways that you can manifest most powerfully. This is exactly, my manifestation method. It's through
Mm-hmm.
authentic self-expression and self-love. I find it's actually one of the missing pieces in a lot of, manifestation methods that are taught. um, we kind of skip over, or it's often skipped over, the importance of being your true self, because a lot of what people want is based off of what people have told them what they should want or what they need to do. Like, we've all heard the classic, like, go to school, get a job, get married, have kids. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
the white picket fence, there's a reason why white picket fence is in the dialogue, right? For some reason, that's something we were all told that we should want, right? But if we're all told that that's what we should want, and if everybody in the world wants those things, like what what is special and unique and different about that, right? We're all different people, which means we should all want different things. And there's a lot of beauty in diversity. There's a lot of beauty in honoring yourself and being true to yourself and having the courage to honor yourself and let your freak flag fly. Let it fly, and just really have that self-love to um yeah, call in the things that you're manifesting.
Yeah, something about like this idea that it's like if you pretend to be someone you're not, you'll have their dream life and not yours.
It's so true.
Yeah, just like it makes you think like this idea that it's like and I've never really liked this phrase, but this idea that you're always manifesting, like even if you're like manifesting your fears, like this idea that like you're manifesting the dream life of the person you're pretending to be. And if that's not who you are, then how can you change that? So I'd love to hear more about how can you go from self-abandonment to self-love to self-compassion, like in this space where you're ready to be magnetic.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that about like we're always manifesting. It's so true. And because of that truth, people are often very afraid of, feeling bad, or having a day where
Mm,
they have negative thoughts, or
mm,
being in a bad or sad or mad mood,
mhm,
and they think, oh my gosh, like being in a bad mood or having this negative thought is going to affect my ability to manifest. Or if I have this negative thought, it means that I'm going to manifest this negative thing, right? This is where we have to kind of practice discernment, and we have to practice self compassion,
mhm,
because at the end of the day, we're human. And because we're human, it means that we're going to have intrusive thoughts. We're going to have, off days. We're going to have sad, mad, bad days. And it's just part of being human. And it does not affect your ability to manifest unless you prevent yourself from feeling your feelings authentically. So if you're having a bad day, if you're in a bad or a sad mood, if something happens in your life that has affected you emotionally and you're upset about it, and if you prevent yourself from feeling upset by it because you think feeling upset by it is going to prevent your manifestation, then not allowing yourself to have that authentic feeling of feeling upset by something, that's the thing that's going to block your manifestation. Not feeling upset. It's not letting yourself feel how your body needs to feel or how your mind needs to feel. That's what will block your manifestation. And this ties right back into this authentically letting yourself be who you are, right? It's impossible to be happy and, you know high vibe 100% of the time. It's just not possible. It's not sustainable. And I don't say that to like discourage anyone or put anyone down. If anything, I say it to, give yourself permission to be human. Have a
mhm,
bad day every once in a while,
mhm.
because it's going to happen, right? It's part of the human experience. And those bad days, it doesn't mean anything about, affecting your manifestations, other than let yourself feel the feelings that you have. Similarly to give yourself permission to be authentic, give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling. In fact, giving yourself that permission to feel what you're feeling will usually help you move through it quicker. Not that we have to put a timeline on anything, but you'll be able to feel it more deeply. And then with that compassion piece, you can move through it, and you can really celebrate that you're a human and you're having a human experience, and it doesn't have to affect your ability to manifest. It just means that you're human and you've had a bad day or a sad day, and that's fine.
Yeah, for me, I always think about how I'll get into like cycles. I'll be like, oh, I'm not feeling well, I can't write. And then like whenever I like make a commitment, which is like what I did with this blog, I remember that when I'm not feeling well and I write, like it's like an outlet, and that
Mhm.
like a lot of that like extra energy like becomes focus, and it like reminds me of like what my soul is aligned with and like what it's not, and it gives me a chance to release the things that I'm holding on to that don't belong to me. And I think like for anyone who has ever experienced like the need to people please or to self-abandon to make other people feel safe. My coach Tom Bilyeu says to burn your flesh to keep others warm. That's like that's like his phrase for it. So I'd
Yeah.
love to go into this idea of boundaries. And first, boundaries with other people so that like we're not self-abandoning to, like please other people or to get a sense of validation in our relationships. Like how do we have healthy boundaries with other people?
Yeah. So to touch on the first part of your question about like what you're sharing about writing and that being that outlet, right? That doing
Hmm.
that for yourself, even on the days that you don't want to do it, that is an act of self-love. And that's so important when, you know, we're honoring ourselves, right? In a
Hmm.
moment of need, I always refer to that with my clients. In a moment of need, if you can pull on any act of self-love, big or small, it's still showing your self-love. And doing something like that, that is a beautiful act of self-love. And another beautiful act of self-love, boundaries.
Hmm.
One of the best acts of self-love are having boundaries with others and with ourselves. Now, the interesting thing about boundaries that a lot of people don't understand is that there's a difference between a request and a boundary, right? So oftentimes people will request something of someone, and they'll label it as a boundary. And then when that person doesn't meet that request, even we do this with ourselves. If we say like, hey, I want to do this, and then we treat it as a request, it's the same anatomy of the boundary, right? But oftentimes people get lost in labeling a request as a boundary, which then can lead to a lot of disappointment or a lot of further self-abandonment. In reality, a boundary is a request paired with an action if the request is not met. So that's how we take ownership over our boundary, right? It's not about what the other person does. It's about what we will do if the other person cannot meet the request. And it's important to keep in mind that a request is not it's not a demand, right? It's a request, it's a question, it's a desire. It's not something that needs to be met. Where the boundary comes in is what we do in response to whether that person can meet the request or not. So an example of a boundary might be, sorry, an example of a request might be, I don't want you to, I would like it if you don't speak to me that way, right? That's an example of a request. An example of a boundary would be, I would like it if you don't speak to me that way. And if you continue to speak to me that way, I'm going to leave the conversation. And that
Mm.
puts the action on you to honor yourself and your boundary if that request is not met. That way, we can't control other people's behavior. So if they're unable to meet the request, that's fine. I mean, sometimes it's not fine, but at least we have our boundary to keep us safe. We know what we're going to do in response to them either meeting the request or not meeting the request. So that's kind of where people can get lost, is we label requests as boundaries and vice versa. But a boundary is about what we will do in response to what someone else will do. And those are major acts of self-love, is having boundaries. It allows us to keep ourselves in versus keeping people out. It's more so about, okay, how do I stay in alignment? How do I take care of myself? How do I
Mm.
honor my self-love? What do I need right now? And this is how we learn to prioritize ourselves and deepen our own self-love through boundaries.
What is an example of having boundaries with ourselves?
Having boundaries with yourself, this can be so many things. It can be having a check-in with your body and seeing how you feel about something, whether it's like before a social event, say you have like a social event coming up or later in the day, but you have a headache, right? Having a boundary with yourself might look like, I honor how I feel, and I give myself permission to say no to something if I don't have the energy or the capacity to do it. And then it's on you to check in with yourself if you have the capacity or the energy to do it when the time comes. If
Mm.
you don't have the energy or the capacity and you still go, you're breaking that boundary with yourself. If you don't have the capacity or the energy and you don't go, you're honoring that boundary with yourself, right? And if you have the capacity and the energy and you go, great, that's awesome. But that's an example of a boundary that you can have. Another one is, if you're it's kind of like, yeah, another one can be around, nourishing yourself, or
Mm.
treating yourself and your body and your mind with respect, right? Like a
Mhm.
boundary can be, you know I speak to myself with love and respect. And then that's on you to kind of monitor that and have check-ins with yourself. There is so much grace and power in having check-ins with yourself. That can be a really good way to check in with how your boundaries are going. um yeah, other boundaries with yourself is, having a check-in with yourself and seeing how you really feel about certain situations or certain people. Even if you know that you're going to be around someone that might be triggering, it can be having that boundary with yourself. Okay, I'm either going to limit my access to this person, or I'm not going to be around that person, and trusting yourself and honoring that boundary if the time comes to it. But yeah, there are so many boundaries that we can have with and for ourselves. One of my boundaries that I have with myself is, movement. I find that I have a clearer mind and I have better sleep and I feel better throughout the day. I'm more energized if I do yoga at least,
Mhm.
3, 4 times a week, right? So one of my boundaries is, I honor my body by going to yoga three to
Hmm.
four times per week. And then it's on me to meet that boundary.
What exactly is a check-in?
A check-in is, oh, I love this question. I love this question. So a check-in is asking yourself what you need at any point in time. So this it can include your mind or your body. So sometimes it's as simple as sometimes we wait for something to happen before we have a check-in, but in reality we can have a check-in at any point in time. I actually
Hmm.
have alarms set in my phone throughout the day that go off. They're silent alarms, so like I'll see them when the next time I check my phone and the alarm happens to go off. And that's my cue to have a check-in with myself throughout the day. I have a couple of them that go off throughout every single day. But when they go off, I take a pause and I ask myself, okay, what does my body need right now? Sometimes I need a deep breath. Sometimes I need a drink of water. Sometimes I need to go for a walk. Sometimes I need to eat something. Sometimes I need to go to the bathroom or have a nap, or actually I don't nap, but maybe go to bed. But whatever it is, have a rest, have a lay down, take a break from work, or whatever it is. Sometimes it's whatever comes up, you
Hmm.
have to trust yourself to listen to what comes up. And the thing about having a check-in is then that piece that we're starting to get into about self-trust. It's trusting that whatever comes up is coming up for a reason. So if you're listening to this right now, I invite you to have a check-in right now and ask yourself, okay, what does my mind need right now? Do you need 30 seconds of stillness, of peace? Does your mind need to have a sip of water? Does your mind need to, take a pause from what it's dealing with right now? Ask yourself, what does my body need right now? Maybe your body needs to have a deep breath. Maybe your body needs to sit down or lie down. Maybe your body needs to, shake it out or do whatever it needs to do to reset. The key with having a check-in is asking your mind and your body what it needs, and then listening when your body and your mind tells you what it needs. So if your mind is telling you we need a break and you don't give your mind a break, this this is it's all information, right? But it's a cue to kind of not test, I don't like the word test, but it's a cue to kind of experiment with, you know, how you communicate with your body and if you're listening or not. Sometimes we just go, go, go and push through, push through, push through. But it's one thing to have a check in and ask yourself what you need. It's another thing to listen to what your body and your mind say and honor what it is that you need. So that's pretty much what a check in looks like. It's fairly simple. Sometimes it's not always easy, but it's fairly simple to have a check in.
What are your tips for trusting your intuition and listening to what your body needs?
My tips for trusting your intuition, you know, this is a good one because it can be tricky to listen to your intuition, especially if in the past you have fractured your self trust and you have not listened to your intuition and it has quote unquote led you astray. And it can feel quite threatening to start to trust your intuition again because our intuition is not that logical sometimes. It's based in like feeling and it's based in, um, you know, trust. And
Mhm.
sometimes it can be challenging to trust what we don't know or what we're not familiar with. But intuition will typically always feel peaceful. You'll always feel aligned. It might feel unfamiliar and uncertain, which can, maybe create some nervousness or some feelings of, oh gosh, we're heading into the unknown, right? But
Mhm.
there will still be that sense of calm and your intuition saying this is the right move for us versus that feeling of anxiety or panic or that takes us out of our alignment, right? The fear based, if it's fear based, that's not rooted in intuition typically. But if you're starting to play around with listening to your intuition, it's important to there's two things that are important. The first one is it's important to experiment with it. and honor your capacity and tell yourself that this is something that you're experimenting with and that you want to learn more about and that you want to become more familiar with listening to your intuition. And start by just playing little games with yourself. Like, okay, like what's my intuition saying about which apple I should pick at this fruit stand?
Hmm.
This apple. Okay, well, why did my intuition say this one? And play a game with yourself, see what you come up with. Then you can start to play, games with your intuition where there's maybe bigger decisions at stake, like, you know, which friend to hang out with or which job
Hmm.
to apply for. You can start to
Hmm.
rely on your intuition, but your intuition works the same regardless of how small or big the decision is. It's a matter of trusting it, which is why starting small with something like choosing, a certain produce at the grocery store might be a fun way to experiment with it. Um, so the experimentation is one component. The other component is compassion and just having so much compassion for yourself, right? Especially if you're coming from a place where you have not listened to your intuition and it might have not worked out for you. It's
Hmm.
really to have compassion for yourself and speak to yourself in a way that, honors, in the past we didn't listen to our intuition. And maybe I've judged myself for that. And maybe I've said mean things to myself about that. And I forgive myself for that. And I was doing the best I could with what I had at that time. And I'm going to experiment with trusting my intuition and seeing how this works out for me. That's how having compassion with yourself might show up in your self talk if you're experimenting with trusting your intuition a little bit more.
Yeah, for me, I have like a strong gut instinct and intuition, but then I think I don't always have confidence in like creating boundaries. Like and this is really important that you brought up the difference between a request and boundaries. I used to like have a gut instinct and I'd ask like I'd request like whether it be like in a relationship, like what I was comfortable with, or like in like platonic relationships, like what I feel is right for me. And I would kind of like self-abandon if they didn't like fulfill the request, and I wouldn't have any action. I wouldn't have the courage to take any action or to even know what action was right. I would just feel, and I think sometimes like this is where like you can build up resentments in relationships, and it's not so much because the other person is negative or toxic, but it's because you haven't learned how to place boundaries that protect yourself. And like, what do you do in those situations where you don't know what boundary to place, or like what is the appropriate way to respond when someone doesn't fulfill a request?
It's a beautiful opportunity to have a check-in, right? And
Mm,
if you give yourself permission to experiment and to learn, you can have a check-in with yourself and ask yourself, okay, what is a boundary I could experiment with right now? You can experiment with that boundary and then you can ask yourself, how did that feel to have that boundary? If it felt safe, you can continue with it. If it felt off, you can ask yourself, what felt off about that for me? It's always about having like continual communication with yourself, having those check-ins with yourself and having that inner dialogue really is important because it's the root of our relationship with ourselves and being able to, you know, forgive and experiment, give ourselves that permission, that space to explore and to figure out our next move. It's not always about making the right decision. Sometimes
mm,
it's about trusting that from just making a decision, it will
mm,
eventually lead you to the right decision because you trust yourself to figure it out. So it'll either be the right decision or you'll use your self trust to make the right decision. It's the same thing with experimenting with boundaries and having a check in with yourself. Okay, how did having that boundary feel? Or if you set a boundary and you didn't follow through on it, it might be asking yourself, what part of that scenario felt too threatening for me to hold my boundary? How can I create
mm.
safety with myself to express this boundary in a different way or to express this boundary in the future, whatever that might look like?
Yeah, I think that's really powerful because so much of this feeds into each topic, like this idea of like self-love and like having boundaries, and then self-abandoning when like you're not sure about the boundary, or like you don't trust your intuition. And I think it can kind of like feel like a mess. So I'd love to have you talk about like how can we learn to love ourselves and give ourselves permission to make mistakes.
Yeah, well, this is perfect because the very nature of us being human means that by nature, we've already got permission to make mistakes because we're imperfect humans. So that can almost be relieving for some,
Mm.
maybe this can lift this false notion that you need to be perfect, because it's just not possible. And it's not, I don't say it's not possible to be demeaning. I say it's not possible to, provide a way forward where you do have that permission to make mistakes. um, Making mistakes is not only very human, it can also be very empowering. And it can also be a way that we model to other people that they can also make mistakes, and that it's okay, and that it's not the end of the world, and that it's a part of the human experience. And making mistakes is also a way that we learn. It's the best way that we learn, I would even say. Like, maybe that's arguable, but it's one of the best ways that we learn. We often don't know that something is quote unquote wrong until it's wrong, and then we learn from it. We have that check in and we say, huh, something about that felt off. Well, what was that felt off? What's a new decision I can make? Um, you know, it's really having that flexibility with yourself to open yourself up to other options if something doesn't go a way that you think it's going to go or that you want it to go.
Yeah, this brings up something that I feel is really deep, and that's this idea that sometimes abusers can make us feel like the true version of ourselves is this perfect being, and like makes everyone happy all the time. And can you kind of like dispel that myth and really like come up with like this permission slip for us to make mistakes, and that our true self is always making mistakes because we're doing what feels right to us, and we're not overriding other people's needs with our own.
Yeah, so abusers can absolutely take advantage of people who might struggle with, self-esteem. And one way that sometimes we attach our worth to other people is by how we're pleasing them or how they
Mhm.
perceive us. And this is where a lot of that self-abandonment occurs. But exactly as you said, the permission slip, this is something I practice with clients. I quite literally in a session will, act out signing a piece of paper, writing a permission slip for my client, whatever that permission slip might be for, whether it's permission to be yourself, permission to take up space, permission to rest, permission to have fun, even if you have a long to-do list, whatever you need permission for. In this case, permission to be your authentic self and to not self-abandon. you know Visualize having that piece of paper, that permission slip in front of you. And you can even get a piece of paper and write permission to at the top, and then write whatever it is you need permission for. And then you can sign that piece of paper and hold it to your heart and really sink into that feeling of, wow, I just gave myself permission to be my authentic self. I just gave myself permission to say no to someone who's requiring me to self abandon. I just gave myself permission to take up space as my authentic self and to, do things that I enjoy instead of prioritize things that other people enjoy, or say no to something that I don't want to do, which might in turn disappoint someone who's expecting me to do it. Um, these are ways that we dismantle that concept of self abandonment, especially when we're dealing with relationships. It can be very challenging, but it's also very rewarding.
Yeah, tell me about the role of self-talk and self-love.
Oh yeah, this is like one of the like pillars of self-love. It's how you talk to yourself, how you talk about yourself. And sometimes, you know, sometimes I have clients who are like, oh, what does it matter how I speak to myself? To which I say, it's arguably the only thing that matters. It's pretty much the only thing that matters. What do you mean? What does it matter? It's the only thing that matters, because the voice in your head, that's that's what you live with. And the voice that's in your head, that it's often what tends to channel the voice that you speak out into the world, right? So you might think that it doesn't matter if you like make a joke at your expense, for example. But the thing about our subconscious is that our subconscious does not know the difference between sarcasm and real life, real language. So if you're
Mhm.
making a joke at your expense, or if you're saying something negative to and about yourself, if you're putting yourself down, your body, your mind does not know otherwise than to take that as the truth. And the
Mhm.
more that a belief or a phrase or a thought is repeated, the more your mind and your body will embed it as the truth. And if you are embedding negative self talk, putting yourself down, insults as the truth, then that's going to be reflected in how you treat and behave and either respect or maybe disrespect yourself. And the way we treat ourselves is ultimately how we nourish ourselves, how we conduct ourselves, the things that we do and don't tolerate. Like, so to go back to what I started this whole rant that I've now got very passionate about, as you can probably hear in my voice, got very worked up here. So yeah, does self-talk matter? Yeah, it's like the only thing that matters. And if you start to tweak your self-talk, you can do this by, again, having a check-in with yourself, but also like practicing more awareness around how you're speaking to yourself, and then asking yourself, is there an alternative thing I could have said there? Or is there another way I could have said that? Or I wonder if there's space for me to give myself a compliment. It's not as easy as deciding you're going to speak to yourself with love and, you know, so kindly. It's not about going from 0 to 100. It's not about doing a 180. It's about getting into a state of curiosity and giving yourself that permission to wonder if there's a different way you can speak to yourself, and then experimenting with it, and then taking a chance at, maybe I could say something differently to myself this time. Okay, say something different. Okay, how did that feel? Oh, it felt kind of nice to say something different. Or on the other hand, if negative self-talk is very prevalent for someone, it might feel very unfamiliar, very foreign to start to experiment with saying something like I like myself. I won't even go to I love myself yet, but sometimes it can feel very threatening to someone's nervous system to even think about saying I like myself if for years they've told themselves that they've hated themselves. If you have that check in, and if you pay attention to how your body responds, how your nervous system responds, you can use tools like nervous system regulation, um, to start to regulate your body so that you can create more safety in your body when you experiment with having thoughts like, I like myself, as compared to having other thoughts that maybe were a little bit more negative in nature. But what you'll notice over time as you do experiment with improving your self talk and really rooting your self talk in self love, how you feel about yourself will change. How you think about yourself will change. And when how you feel and how you think about yourself changes, your life changes. You start prioritizing things that you love. You start feeling more empowered to being your authentic self. You start taking up space in places where you otherwise might have shrunk yourself or stayed small. You start to honor yourself in your beliefs and your opinions, and what you tolerate changes. What you tolerate changes. And this is how, when these are things we start to embody over time, and it can happen quickly if these practices are put in place, your whole life will change.
Yeah, for me, I did a blog post a couple of years ago and it was like 11 reasons to keep going. And one of them was that nature never judges, and just this idea that like if you have like constant negative self-talk, or if like say the people closest to you are toxic toward you or abusive, like you can go out in nature and like all of that is like benevolent, and there's like there's nothing like coming at you, like there's a peace, you're not being judged. And like I feel that way with like plants too, like almost like kind of a serenity. And like I think that's so powerful. And I it actually inspired a suicide prevention Discord where we do run like gratitude challenges. And I think to myself like this idea that like sometimes like we have to look for the peace that we want to achieve in our life, and we have to like give the universe the grace to let us receive it before we give it to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Leaning on that faith in the universe or in whatever higher power you believe in, that gives you so much room to experiment and to exist and to
Mm,
feel supported when you aren't maybe capable of giving yourself that support in the moment. And what you said earlier about, or just now about, the judgment,
mhm,
it's that the judgment can be so heavy. And so for anyone who has dealt with self-judgment or, yeah, negative self-talk in the form of self-judgment, I have a very, tangible tool that I will teach about how you can start to shift out of self-judgment and into, self-acceptance or self-love. And this is what I like to call being in a state of curiosity. So I'll say two statements, they're the exact same. One of them is from a lens of self judgment, and one of them is in the state of curiosity. So the first one is, oh, why did I do that? Very rooted in self judgment. The second one is, I wonder why I did that. That's rooted in curiosity, right? Self judgment takes away the ability to be an observer to your behavior and your thoughts, versus the state of curiosity allows you to look at what has happened without judgment. And when judgment is removed, we actually create space to make a meaningful change. And so if you notice yourself judging yourself, if you're asking those judgmental questions to yourself, I invite you to step into a state of curiosity instead, and be willing to sit in that state of curiosity and open yourself up to other possibilities of how else you could speak to yourself.
yeah, I think that's so powerful. I'd love to hear more about your membership.
Oh yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, I just launched it actually. Um, yeah, I when I started my business, I thought about or I did a lot of, exploring myself and a lot of personal development myself. And I, worked with coaches, I was in memberships myself, and I paid attention to the things that resulted in my own
Mm,
embodiment of the person
mm,
that I wanted to become. And so I tried to create that's what I tried to create in my membership. So my business is called Zoe Magnetic. My name's Zoe. Magnetism is all about manifestation and, being a magnet to your dream life, essentially. My membership that I just launched is called the Zoe Magnetic Universe. And essentially, I included all of the components of all of the, coaches, courses, memberships, programs that have really helped me create meaningful change that is sustainable. And that's essentially done through what I'm calling embodiment calls. So inside the membership, we have a weekly embodiment call every Sunday at 7 p.m. EST. I'm in Australia, so that's 9 a.m. Monday morning for me, but every Sunday night at 7 p.m. I wanted it to be at this time of the week as well. So it's that, either the end of the week, start of the week, where we can have a reset, have that check in with ourselves, and
mm.
really set ourselves up for the week ahead so that we are embodying the person who is able to call in the things that they're calling in, the things that they're manifesting. Um, so yeah, I found that in all the programs, the coaching programs and memberships that I've been a part of, the live calls have been the most impactful, because it's a way to hold yourself accountable and to know that this is time every week that I'm putting aside for myself to do the practices, walk the walk, so to say, not just learn about the things that you need to do, but actually do the things that you need to do so that you are creating that space to manifest whatever it is that you want. And then so that's what's available in the embodiment tier.
Hmm.
And then in the magnetic tier, on top of the weekly embodiment calls, I also am going to be running a monthly magnetize session workshop based on manifestation, where there's going to be different themes every month. And in addition, there's going to be a monthly connection call where every member can come up with their own questions they have specific to what they're going through, whether it's mindset, whether it's manifestation related, self-love, nervous system regulation. And I do live coaching on the spot in the call, specifically based off of whatever it is any member needs or wants to be addressed. So it's very customized coaching in the magnetic tier. But yeah, and then essentially the modalities that I teach from are, manifestation rooted in nervous system regulation and self-love. So the practices in the embodiment calls are going to be rooted in self-love and nervous system regulation, because those are two things that I believe really help you manifest with much more ease when you're regulated and when you're rooted in self-love. And so this is the way that I teach manifestation, because that it's through those practices that I've been able to manifest a lot of beautiful things in my life. And not just like things, but
Hmm.
like my relationship to myself, my mindset, my
Hmm.
self-love. These are things that I've manifested as well through this method, you could say. And it's the number one thing I get asked about in my audience. So I, yeah, I figured I better give the people what they want. And they want to learn about manifestation. So I'm here to teach it to them.
I love that. If there's one thing you want everyone to remember from today's episode, what would that be?
The greatest gift you can give yourself is self-love, and, um, you know, give yourself permission to do whatever it takes to give yourself self-love. That's exactly how you can live, a free life, an empowered life, and an authentic life. And yeah, have the bravery and the courage to do the bold thing and to create that self-love for you.
Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Katie. It's been awesome.